You might have been following some of the changes already over the last 2 years or so since the Legault government introduced its new language laws. They're supposed to strengthen some protections of French, go a bit farther than Bill 101. So, for example,
for service in English, press 9. Please note that as of June 1st, 2023, communications with the Quebec government are solely in French, except in certain situations. If you are in one of the following situations...
So you've probably had to deal with that already at some point. Also, many contracts now have to be in French. Immigrants are going to be dealt with in French only after 6 months. We've talked about some of those things quite a bit. Now, lately, CBC has been reporting on some changes that have been announced and are to come into effect soon. One involves signs. Our colleague Isaac Olson made one video to try to explain some of it. It can get complicated. That's part of the point, I think. But in this video, Isaac shows some imaginary new signs with massive French descriptors. So, for example, shows a Subway restaurant. Right now, the sign just says Subway, English word. The video adds the imaginary French word restaurant, really, really big. And Costco, it already has the French descriptor entrepôt, but not in a way that's big enough to satisfy the new law. So in the video, it gets a massive entrepôt.
What about Home Depot? Or Subway? Or could Costco also change its look? And the same for Dollarama. All 400 of them. Believe it or not, changes like this would barely satisfy the storefront sign draft regulation.
So that's a little bit from the video from Isaac Olson. Then there are questions around your washing machine and how that might have to look.
There's some concern that Quebec consumers might soon have fewer choices and end up paying more for many products, thanks to the new language law. It's because of provisions in the draft regulations for what is commonly known as Bill 96. Lawyers who specialize in business compliance with Quebec's French language charter say companies might end up quitting the market rather than try to relabel and repackage their merchandise.
Regulations seem to suggest that your washing machine, for example, will need to have French words on it. So not just spin cycle, but also cycle d'essorage.
French should clearly predominate. During the 5 past years, Office Québécois Langue Française received 155% more complaints. So Quebecers are afraid of what's happening in French here.
That's the minister responsible for much of this, and it's Jean-François Roberge from the CAQ government, who we requested and who declined our invitation. We had all kinds of questions we wanted to ask about exactly how much of this is set in stone already and exactly what will the changes mean. So to some extent here, we're going to be operating on some assumptions about what we think the new regulations are going to mean. We're going to try to figure things out, and we want to hear from you. So what do you think about the plans? And if you've got questions, we're going to try to answer those as well. We're going to speak with some lawyers who are going to try to help us out. So phone number 514-597-4500. Toll free 1-877-597-4500. Our text line 514-566-9066. Joining us now is Marc Perez, who is the founder of a group called Parlons de Québec. Let's talk about Quebec. Marc Perez, thanks for being here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here.
I don't know a lot about your group, so tell me about that before we get into this and these changes.
Okay. So Parlons du Québec, or Let's Talk About Quebec, is a Montreal-based think tank conducting comprehensive research, analyzing data, and cultivating innovative solutions to offer informed advice on diverse political, economical, social issues. To reflect a broad spectrum of insights, we are committed to consulting with experts across various fields, and we are engaging with the public through a structured voting system, fostering rich dialogue and incorporating diverse perspectives. Okay.
So tell me then, around these changes that we're talking about here today on Bill 96, some of these tweaks, changes to language law. What do you think?
These tweaks are definitely costing a second exodus, like we saw in '77 when Bill 101 came out. We recently heard how Walmart and other distribution centers have decided to cancel their plans to open their distribution center inside Quebec. We've lost mega businesses like Volkswagen that chose to go to Ontario instead of Quebec. And bottom line, all these language laws are going to hurt us again, and we're going to head for another depression, like in the 70s when Bill 101 came out.
Okay, I mean, we could talk about all those things that you're saying. Maybe we should just talk here for a second. I mean, with the Walmart thing, you're saying that that's because of language laws, that Walmart is deciding not to open that new center here or make that investment here?
That's correct. I'm saying that these language laws are adding a lot of barriers, that creating this distribution center would complicate a lot of things, because any business in Quebec, because of Bill 96 and 101, have to now, because of Bill 96, they have to have all their inventory labels and everything in French. So this is adding an additional cost to any businesses that comes to Quebec.
Okay. You also mentioned, by the way, Volkswagen, but I mean, you have this company Northvolt who is coming, right? And the way that has been spun is that these are big companies sort of looking for the best subsidies and financial enticements. And some of those companies have been lured to Quebec. Some of those companies have been lured to, for example, Ontario in the case of Volkswagen. We haven't heard a lot about that having to do with language. So how do you think that one, the Volkswagen one, would?
Well, I'm going to go with the Northvolt. I mean, they have to be in Quebec because Quebec has the lithium mine that they need to produce and beg, so they can't really go to Ontario for something like that. But Bill 96 is definitely scaring a lot of businesses away because, first of all the contracts have to be in French. And if they are dealing with any other businesses outside of Quebec, they have to provide a French version of a contract, which means that it's up to the other party to pay for the translation of the contract. If there's going to be litigation in court, the litigation has to be done in Quebec, which means that an Ontario company coming to Quebec will have to litigate its case in French, and it will have to provide all documentation in French. So if there was any communications or mistake or discrepancies between the English document and the Francophone document, the French document, the French document prevails. So if they decide to make a deal for $200 million, but on the French $300 million, well, then they're going to have to pay the $300 million because it's only the French version that oversees it in the courts in Quebec.
Okay. I'm speaking with Marc Perez, who is the founder of the group Parlons de Québec. Let's talk about Quebec. We are talking about some of these changes that we know are coming or changes that we think might be coming to language laws here in Quebec. Want to know how you feel about those. So, for example, on signs, that would be one very visible example, or on labeling, or there are the other things that Marc Perez is talking about. If you have thoughts on all of this, phone number is 514-597-4500. Toll free, it's 1-877-597-4500. Want to know whether you also think this is scaring businesses away from Quebec. Our text line here, 514-566-9066. I should repeat that we asked the Minister Roberge to come on. We asked all kinds of people to come on today to talk about this. We asked people from the CAQ. We asked federal liberals to do this, to come on. We also asked the leader of the Bloc Québécois. So in most cases, we got polite no thank yous. Don't want to come on to talk about this. Do want to hear from you, as I said. So toll-free number, it's 1-877-597-4500. Marc Perez, the CAQ government from the beginning has said, look, French is in this precarious situation in Quebec. That's why we have to do all these things. And I wonder what you make of that argument.
Well, I think the argument is completely fake. I don't agree with it because of a lot of reasons. First of all, in the 70s, 30% of the population was able to have a conversation in French, whereas now in the last census of 2021, we're at 94.1% of us can have a conversation in French. French is the fifth biggest language in the world. And we see that across Canada, there's been an increase of unilingual French. We see that Franco-Ontarians are proud to have their own flag flying all year round in front of their buildings. So French is increasing. It's increasing in New York. There's a French school that was built in either the Bronx or in...
Okay, but that doesn't really speak to the situation of French in Quebec, though.
But what are their goals? What are their objectives? They're never clear on that. The fact that we could have a conversation and read in French, it's done. And Legault keeps on saying it's all about Montreal. It's always Montreal. He says, well, in Montreal, the 89% of businesses do business in French, and that's not enough. We need 100%. In Montreal, there's too much English. When I walk the streets of Montreal, I hear too much English. So it's not Quebec. Let's come down to it. It's Montreal.
Okay, so let's talk about Montreal then.
Yeah. Yeah. So he went after the Anglophone institutions. With a tuition hike, and all of a sudden there's a 30% drop. So now if there's a 30% drop in enrollment, that means that the government has to give less money to less subsidies to these universities, and there's going to be a humongous consequences that these universities are going to die by 1,000 cuts, and eventually they're going to disappear, and Montreal will never be what it was because of this.
All right. So what do you want to see the provincial government do?
Well, first of all, they need to enrich and promote the French in the regions. You know, based on their own studies, the French in the region, when people graduate, if the students graduate high school, is at a level grade 5 or 6 in Montreal. So I think that, first of all, they should focus on improving the French in the outer regions. And I remember reading an article a long time ago, and I was looking for it online, where there's they made a regulation that any French word that has double consonants, like canette, where it's C-A-N-N-E-T-T-E,
okay,
and the students were to write it with C-A-N-E-T-E, it's no longer considered a mistake. So they've lowered their own standards on French within the outer regions, and that's where they should be focusing a lot more. And I mean, if you look at the English Montreal School Board, from what I'm reading, students that graduate from there have a higher French proficiency than anywhere else. So if I was the French government, I would reach out to Joe Ortona and I said, hey, listen, what are you doing? Why is it so successful? And what can we do to implement that into our own school system instead of trying to dissolve the French board, which I already did, and trying to dissolve the English school board?
Marc Perez, I'm going to say thank you to you for coming on here today. Appreciate it. Interesting to speak with you. Thanks again. That's Marc Perez, who's the founder of the group Parlons de Québec. Let's talk about Quebec. We are talking today about Bill 96, some of the things that have happened already, but we're also trying to figure out some of the things that are still on the way. So changes to signs, changes to labeling. If you have questions or if you have thoughts, want to hear from you. So 514-597-4500, toll free 1-877-597-4500. Our text line here, 514-566-9066. And I think I mentioned to you that the CAQ government declined our invitation. Minister Roberge said, no thanks. It would be interesting to hear from someone who says, well, this is what we're doing. Here's what our intentions are. And this is why we are doing it. And we've gotten little inklings of that before from the government. I think you heard a little clip from the minister in our introduction, but wish we had more than that. Phone number again, 514-597-4500. We're joined now by Eliane Elbogen, who is an international property lawyer and trademark agent at Fasken. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. It's an intellectual property lawyer. I wish it was an international property lawyer.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. Intellectual property lawyer. Pardon me. So how much do we know about what these changes are going to mean? And how much uncertainty is there still around some of these things?
Well, there still is quite a bit of uncertainty. We have a pretty good idea of what the impact will be if the draft regulation to Bill 96 is adopted as is in its current form. For example, what we're hearing about a lot is the permanent product inscriptions. So product inscriptions that appear on all types of consumer goods that are permanently engraved or riveted or embossed on a product will also have to be translated to French.
So that's where the washing machines come in?
Yeah, the washing machines and other home appliances and any consumer good or any product that is sold in Quebec.
Okay. Now, it strikes me that there's some confusion, though, about exactly what the draft regulations are calling for. What's your understanding of what we're supposed to see?
Mm-hmm. So our interpretation of the regulation is that any product inscription that is, like I said, permanently engraved on the product that is necessary for the use of the product, which is essentially all product inscriptions, will have to be translated into French. And furthermore, our interpretation is that those French inscriptions will have to appear in at least equal conditions as in another language, so the English inscriptions. Now, the Quebec government has released some information that supplying products with stickers would be sufficient, but our interpretation of the wording of that precise provision in the regulation is that that wouldn't be sufficient. So there is some uncertainty there, and clarification would be needed.
Right. So my reading of the situation so far, and you'll please correct me if I'm wrong here, is the government puts out these draft regulations and says this is going to have French on it, and as you say, it's sort of a permanently engraved sort of thing. I forget the exact term that you used. Mm-hmm. So the inference was that has to be on the machine in a permanent basis, right? And it was on that assumption that people like you and other lawyers were operating and businesses were operating. We've heard the concerns of business groups saying that's going to be quite costly if we have to do that. We're going to talk with one of those groups in a few minutes. Now the government's put out some sort of statement saying, well, a sticker should suffice, but you're saying the draft legislation doesn't say that, right?
Exactly. The regulation does not say that. In fact, it doesn't provide any specifications about how the French inscriptions should appear on a product. And what that means is that the general rule that is provided for in the French language charter will apply. So the general rule is that all product inscriptions have to appear in French, and where there is another language, the French inscriptions should be presented in at least equivalent conditions as in another language, which leads us to believe that if the English inscription is permanently engraved on the product, then the French inscription should also be engraved on the product.
Hence the reaction from some groups representing manufacturers saying that is quite an onerous thing to have to do. And even the sort of suggestion that has been left dangling by some groups, well, maybe we wouldn't be that interested in the Quebec market at that point, right?
Yeah, and I don't think it's a question of being interested in the Quebec market. I think it's just it would be impossible to comply with this provision. So you're left without a choice but to leave the Quebec market. I mean, they're not doing this willingly. There are serious repercussions here, and it would be virtually impossible to comply to create this, separate supply and delivery chain for the Quebec market within the larger North American market. And even the suggestion that a sticker would be sufficient to comply with this obligation also is problematic because, this will create extra waste. It raises serious environmental concerns if we're increasing plastic packaging and other forms of, wasteful packaging that will also be passed down to the consumer.
I want to ask you also about signage. And so I'll ask you a question, and then before I let you answer, I'm also just going to point out, in about a minute, we're going to pause for news headlines. So I'll ask the question. You can start to answer it. Maybe we'll get a little bit more detail after those headlines. But what do we know? Because we heard a little bit of our colleague Isaac Olson's piece that he did about signage, and that also sounds at this point fairly unclear about exactly what signs are supposed to look like and which signs will be affected. So what do we know about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that all signs will be affected. So all exterior public signs, any storefront signage will be affected. The requirement now is that if you want to use a non-French trademark exclusively without French translation, it has to be a registered trademark, and it also has to be accompanied by French text, generic text, or slogan that will have to occupy twice as much visual space on the storefront as the non-French text. So basically, you'd have generic terms like les magasins, les boutiques, cafés, restaurants, and those words will have to be twice as large as the non-French signage inscriptions.
On Radio Noon today, we're talking about what we know and what we think about some of the changes coming in the next phase of changes around Bill 96, mostly having to do with signage and labeling, asking you how you feel about it, also asking you if you have questions. We're trying to get those answered. So the phone number is 514-597-4500. Toll free is 1-877-597-4500. I'm speaking with Eliane Elbogen, who is an intellectual property lawyer, trademark agent at Fasken. So, Maître Elbogen, how does this work for you? Do companies come to you and say, what would this mean for us? Or do you reach out to them and say, here's what we think this might mean?
Both, actually. So for the last year and a half to 2 years, when we started hearing about Bill 96, and then it was adopted in June of 2022, basically ever since then, on a weekly or even daily basis, we're contacted by businesses, clients who want to know what they need to do to come into compliance. And then, as you mentioned, we are also reaching out proactively to our clients to say, hey, this is coming up and this is what you need to do to come into compliance. This is what you need to be aware of. So the clients who reach out to you, and I know I'm asking sort of a pretty broad question here, but how concerned do they seem? Very concerned. They don't know, there is uncertainty around what is required of them when it comes to signage, when it comes to product packaging and labeling. So they want to be compliant with the legislation and the regulation. But at this stage, with the uncertainty that surrounds it, there are a lot of there's financial implications, administrative implications. So if you have to change signage, for example, you have to potentially do a rebrand, order a new sign for all of your retail locations, have those signs installed, go through the municipal permit process. All of that takes time, costs money. So you might not necessarily want to go through that just yet if you're uncertain of how it will be implemented.
Right. I appreciate you coming on today and talking to us about some of this. Thanks very, very much for being here.
My pleasure.
It's Maître Eliane Elbogen, who is an intellectual property lawyer, trademark agent at Fasken. Phone number 514-597-4500. Toll free 1-877-597-4500. Let's go to Montreal West. Glenn is here. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Shawn.
So what do you think?
Well, I guess there's sort of two things that come to mind. I guess first off, I certainly understand that if you were to open up, a new coffee maker, and you want to read the instruction manual, that you'd want to have instructions in the language in which you're most comfortable. And so I guess that would be an issue that was probably addressed in legislation in the 70s. And we're talking about more like how the thing looks.
I guess the labels around the buttons on the coffee maker, right?
Yeah, well, let's say brew later or something else. But one thing I didn't understand about this is, a lot of these appliances are made by pretty big multinationals. So if I'm in France and I buy a Samsung washing machine, what does it look like? And I don't know, maybe if it comes in two colors already and they're already stocking, the white one and the black one, then I guess is Home Depot simply going to be able to get the one with the French labels that was destined somewhere else? And
so the argument that I've heard, and we also reached out to some manufacturers groups, and they're on the long list of people to whom we did reach out who did not want to talk about this today. And maybe that's because of the large degree of uncertainty around all of it. But the suggestion seems to be that it would be very expensive and perhaps impossibly expensive to do a production run for a small market like Quebec. Whether that's true or not is a complete other story, but that seems to be the idea. And, we heard a few months ago, or a few weeks ago rather, about U.S. trade representatives bringing up concern to the Canadian government around this. So I think at this point there is uncertainty and, some concern, to use air quotes, about some of those things, but maybe not answers.
Right. I guess if you were a smaller manufacturer with primarily a North American distribution, this would be a really big deal and might make you think twice about this percentage of the overall North American market. Perhaps some of the behemoths that are already distributing into French markets would have product that they could direct. Yeah, interesting.
Thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
You too. Phone number 514-597-4500, toll free 1-877-597-4500. .38 as we continue here on Radio Noon. And I'm happy to say, because there were so many groups who did not want to speak to us today and so many organizations and politicians, a couple of people wanted to speak with us, including Benjamin Roos, who joins me now, policy analyst at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Benjamin Roos, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Okay, so what are you hearing about when it comes to some of these changes?
Yeah, so some changes, as stated before, started to come into effect on June 1st, 2022. Since then, we have seen updates and measures every year, with the latest being on mostly business signage and packaging, and also franchisation processes and businesses. And we've heard a lot of concerns from business owners, not only to the cost that those measures will add to them, but also the confusion that comes from those new measures, that some business owners don't seem to understand what it really means for them. And even for us, we needed to deep dive into the regulation to understand better what it meant for business owners.
So when you do that, when you take the deep dive, do you figure it out?
Yeah, we needed to have a meeting with the OQLF as well to get better explain what the new measures would be implemented. And that's also one of the things we raised with them, that many business owners don't have that chance that we had at CFIB to meet with them. So we asked them to make it even simpler and clearer about the new regulations for business owners in Quebec.
Okay. On the signage, because right now, at least, that actually seems to be maybe more clear than the labeling. Or am I wrong? Is that cleared up for you at this point?
It definitely got cleared up on the business signage and packaging. Okay. As stated before, starting June 1st, 2025, there will need to be French predominance in place for public signs and poster of a trademark. It's also the case for product labels, but the business will be able to add terms in French to have more French and English, but many businesses will need to make substantial changes to their signage to comply with the new regulation on business signage.
Now, so the government's been saying about that the changes that they're going to have to make should cost somewhere in the range of $7 to $15 million. And I wonder, what do you make of that amount?
Well, with the amount of businesses that raised up this issue with us, that we called them as well to know, we believe that this 7 to 15 millions for the new measures announced, we think it's undervalued of the real cost. We can think of business owners that will need to do signage. It's in the thousands of dollars to just redo the whole poster, the whole redesign, like the Faskin lawyer raised before me. And also some business owners have many locations, which means that they need to double or triple the cost of those new measures on the signage. So we think that $7 to $15 million is not realistic of the real cost business owners will have to bear because of the new measures.
So what's a realistic amount?
It's hard to say how much money it is, but we think it's going to be for sure more than that. And of course, it's just a part of the industries that will be affected by it. When we think of business signage that are in English, most of those businesses will have a substantial impact on those businesses. And we know right now that there are many different measures, many problems SMEs are feeling at the moment when we think about labor shortages, the high cost of doing business, the high level of debt as well that business have at the moment. They don't have the capacity to bear the new cost made by these new measures.
I suppose one argument might be Quebec is not just, a place that is a headache and that represents costs, but is also a market, right, for these companies, and that these companies would be or should be willing to make these changes in order to still benefit from that market. And I wonder, what do you make of that?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And even on that question, we surveyed our members, our business owners in Quebec, and most of them said that they're not against French languages and protecting it. Most of our membership agree with the idea of protecting French language. However, it's not on the goal, but rather on how it's implemented, with all the extra costs that they're seeing right now and the paperwork that this will add on business owners. Most of them don't agree with the mean, and they agree with the fact that we need to protect French language, and they agree with it, and they're happy to do so. But with the current regulations and the new measures that are being announced, they feel that it's an extra cost that they just can't bear at the moment.
So what would be a way of making all of those things true, right? That it is something that is worth doing, but the way the government's proposing to do it is too expensive. So what would you like to see, or what would the CFIB like to see?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because as I said, we agree with the goal of these measures, but we do ask governments to have more flexibility on smaller firms, smaller businesses, to be more understanding of their reality at the moment and the economic environment that they're in, and to give them as well more time to comply. We see these new measures are being announced now, and the implementation date is in 1.5 years from now, which doesn't give that much time to business owners to comply, to make all the paperwork. And on the paperwork side of things, we ask governments to simplify the paperwork, to make it easier to comply and less time consuming. And at the end of the day, we also ask for some financial support for businesses that will need to be obliged to change their business signage. There's also this second measures that was announced in the Francization process, and this will add, once again, a lot of paperwork to business owners. So this is a great example where governments can reduce red tape by making documentation simpler and clearer.
I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you for having me.
Benjamin Roos, who is a policy analyst from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, CFIB. You're listening to Radio Noon, and our phone number is 514-597-4500. Toll free, it's 1-877-597-4500. We're going now to Dale. I'm not sure where Dale's calling from, but I know that I'm going to speak with Dale. Hi, Dale.
Hello, how are you?
Quite well, thanks. Where are you calling from?
Good, I'm calling from Montreal.
Okay, perfect. And so what do you think?
Well, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the Task Force on Linguistic Policy. We're a not-for-profit organization that's taking the government of Quebec regarding Bill 96 to court on behalf of individuals, on behalf of matters like this.
Okay, so nice to meet you on the radio, Dale. So I was going to ask, what do you think of these measures? But I think you've just answered in your introduction. So excessive?
Well, absolutely excessive. I mean, we have many business owners, people trying to make money, people trying to make a living here in Quebec, and the Quebec government is continuously making it more onerous for them to do so. This is just one of actually many measures that are already in Bill 96.
So what specific parts of this make you think, okay, no, that's too far?
Well, I mean, it's clear that it seems that they want to eradicate English in Quebec to protect French. But let's remember, there's 1.25 million.
It's clear from the things we've been talking about today, or you think it's clear sort of more generally?
I think more generally with all the measures that they have been taken, what's already in Bill 96 and the new measures that are coming. Last year, they promised that there was going to be 50 measures that they were going to be taking to promote French, as they say, and I say that in quotation marks. And the tuition hikes was the first of them, and now we're seeing more coming out. We've actually launched an interlocutory injunction on May 17th, just passed, to ask the courts to stop such measures.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I thank you for calling in.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's the Task Force on Linguistic Policy.
Yeah, we've spoken to people from the Task Force before. Thank you for phoning in today. That's Dale. Let's stay on the phone lines here. We're going to downtown Montreal, and Jean is here. Hi, Jean.
Hi, good afternoon, Eric. Shawn, sorry.
That's okay.
Terribly sorry. I just want to mention, so the idea came up earlier in the program about, changing production shipments from Francophone countries to Quebec, countries that have electronic devices and whatnot with Francophone labeling. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. If you take a stove or anything that's electronic, it's got certification specific to that geographic region, specific to Europe. You can't just take those appliances and start shipping them to Quebec because they have French labels. Additionally, the way of operating is very different, not only just because of the electrical standards, the certification standards, but you take a stove in France, they don't actually use a temperature range in metric like we do. They use levels and steps. So it's very different. So the idea of, being able to take something that's currently being shipped to a different country that speaks French, that's electronic, and start having it here, it really doesn't work like that. And the only other thing I would add, and take this opportunity to make a comment, if we wanted to do something to really protect French in Quebec, as a Francophone, I can say this, the most important thing would be not to deal with signage, which is superficial, but would deal with the dropout rate in our French high schools, which is the highest in Canada.
I think you're not the first person to mention that today. Thank you so much for phoning in. Interesting. Thanks to you for that. Phone number 514-597-4500, but we're going to go to the toll-free number right now. It's 1-877-597-4500 to Quebec City, and Polly is here. Hi there.
Yes, hi.
So what do you want to talk about?
So it's kind of bouncing back on what the previous speaker just said and one earlier on about appliances coming in from French-speaking countries, because I lived in France for 15 years, and there, in fact, lots of appliances were labelled in English, so on, off, stop, start sort of thing were in English, and that didn't seem to pose a problem to French language laws in France. And then, as the previous speaker said, also, you can't just bring those products in anyway because the electric systems aren't the same, so it's not going to be easy to adapt.
Right. I'm actually looking at a website right now, and because I thought that was an interesting question, I think I'm looking at a washing machine in France, and I think it has French wording on it.
Yeah, or some of the appliances would have French wording, but not all of them. I mean, we still have a few appliances that we brought over them, so I actually went and checked.
Okay, and so some, but not all.
Some, but not all.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that.
Okay, you're welcome.
Again, phone number 514-597-4500, toll-free 1-877-597-4500. We're going to speak with another lawyer now to sort of figure out, or to try to figure out, I think is a much more accurate way of putting it, where things stand and where all this is headed. So we're going to speak with Alexandre Fallon, who is a partner at Osler, Hoskin & Harcourt, lawyer who specializes in business compliance with Quebec's Charter of the French language. Thank you for being here and appreciate that. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so one of the things I have been trying to figure out through this whole hour is how clear all of these coming changes are, or unclear at this point. What would you say?
I would say some of them are unclear. Two elements stand out in terms of lacking clarity. On the product inscription requirements, this new requirement that's put forward in the draft regulation to translate embossed, engraved inscriptions on products. How the equivalency requirement will be applied in that situation. Does that mean that we can sticker French inscriptions on the product, or does the equivalency requirement mean that if it's engraved in English, it also has to be engraved in French? I think that's an open question that the regulation does not clarify.
Yeah, we were speaking to another lawyer before who said, well, the way that the draft regulations were put out, it seemed to suggest that a sticker wouldn't cut it, but then the government itself put out some sort of statement that said, no, we're good with a sticker. So now you have a case where the government's comments and the government's draft regulations don't match. Is that right?
That's right, and it's the same issue with the other ambiguity on signage in terms of what is going to be required when the government says in the draft regulation that the text has to be twice as large. When the first reading of that means that the font size of the French that accompanies a trademark has to be double the font size of the French, and similarly the government says, no, we're talking about surface area, but that's not quite what the regulation says. And the problem is that because Bill 96 introduced a private right of action for any Quebec resident, at the end of the day, the government can say something, but if that's not how it's written, people can still sue, and then it'll be up to judges to decide what it actually means. So it introduces a lot of uncertainty for business, unfortunately. Can I rewind about 15 seconds? You use that term, private right of action. Do you want to explain that again? Yeah, so one of the measures in Bill 96, the amendments to the Charter, was also an amendment to the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms in Quebec, introducing a new right to live in French in accordance with the provisions of the Charter of the French language. And that opens the door to the remedial measures set out in Section 49 of the Charter of Human Rights and Freedom. And so basically a right of action. So a private citizen can now institute an action for damages, including punitive damages, against a business that markets or distributes a non-compliant product, or that issues non-compliant advertising to Quebec residents. And so it really increases the risk for businesses of getting this wrong, which is unfortunate in a situation where the requirements aren't very clear. Right. So everything's supposed to come into effect in June of next year, right? June of 2025? Well, that's true for these new requirements in the draft regulation in terms of the signage requirement per se, but for the product inscription requirement that's been sort of inserted without notice in the draft regulation, the draft regulation actually stipulates that that's 15 days after the publication of the final version in the official Gazette, so it could be much sooner than that. And the private right of action that I just spoke about, that has been in force since June 1st of 2022 when Bill 96 was adopted and became force of law. I'm trying to get a sense, even if it's really just a ballpark figure of how much this could cost businesses.
I know that the government said that to comply with the signage changes, they thought that should cost around $7 to $15 million. Some groups said that seemed like a wild underestimate. Do you have any sense of an amount?
I don't have a sense of an amount. I would agree that it's a wild underestimate. I mean, I've accompanied clients through the previous signage changes in 2016. And, just anecdotally, I know these signs, signs that are lit up, that are of a certain size, they cost tens of thousands of dollars a piece. And so when you think about the multiplication of locations and, if you have a big store with multiple sides to the store, that can go up very, very quickly. And so I would tend to agree that $7 million for the whole province is a gross underestimation.
And that's just to comply with the signage part, right?
Yes, we're not even getting into modification of manufacturing, packaging, design, registration of trademarks. There's a whole host of, and implementing new French language call centers, staffing those call centers, translating websites, developing French versions of non-negotiable contracts. There's a lot of things that businesses have had to do since Bill 96 was adopted in 2022 and have to continue to do as the implementation continues to be carried out between now and 2025.
So given some of the uncertainty you were talking about with, for example, the labeling, and is that going to be a sticker or not a sticker, what's the process legally? Maybe I don't want you to get too legal because I still want to understand the answer, but how do we figure out, okay, government, what did you mean and what do you want?
Well, unfortunately, like I said, there is a lot of dialogue with the government about what you mean. But at the end of the day, if it's not clarified in the law or in the regulation, we don't really gain much because you can have a political staffer tell you this is what I was thinking.
This is okay. It's fine, right? But if it doesn't say that explicitly.
But it's not worth much in front of the court of law when somebody sues you about it, unfortunately. So I think the regulation certainly could be better, and hopefully when the final version comes out, it is better, and the government has heard these concerns that have been expressed by business. Otherwise, it's really a question of risk tolerance of businesses, right? Are they willing to take on the risk, not take it on? And that can take different forms, right? It can be taking the most conservative approach and for example, having the translation engraved if the original English is engraved, or moving to stickering for both French and English, or saying, well, you know what, this product, it's too complicated. It's not worth it for Quebec, and so we're not going to sell it there.
This issue is fairly complicated. I appreciate you coming on and helping us to understand it a bit better. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Have a good afternoon.
You too. It's Alexandre Fallon, who's a partner at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt, lawyer who specializes in business compliance with Quebec's Charter of the French language. Thanks to everybody who got in touch today, whether you phoned or texted. Sorry I didn't have time to get to those texts. Thanks for listening as well. Appreciate you doing that. We're going to post the program online at cbc.ca/listen, or you can use the CBC Listen app. Talk with you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.